switch slides, I can see you. So please just jump into if you've got any questions and problems, or if someone could tell me if there is a raised hand. I appreciate that. So we, with Margaret working on a paper, we figure out that what ecological validity is used in our community. I'm guilty here more than probably most of other people, but happily Margaret found a very good reason actually why we shouldn't use this term. And I will try to explain it. So first of all, the whole term, let's say, comes from the fact that we are thinking about different experiments, especially the moment we speak about different influencing factors, then definitely we shouldn't focus only on those very, very controlled lab experiments, focusing on really one thing. But I don't know, if we want to also understand better the engagement of the into the content, for example, we definitely need a more relaxed setting of the experiment. So there are different experiments from, let's say, very, very controlled, less control, up to the situation where we do not make an experiment, we just observe a user in the real environment. And because of those different experiment design, we need a wording for describing differences between those experiments. And my slide from 2023 showed something like that. So we have internal validity, so experiments that are very precise. We are interested in external validity, which means the conclusions about the real world. And what we can go is to go through ecological validity. This is wrong. And this whole presentation is explanation why it's wrong. So when we have an experiment, we actually have got like two phases of the experiment. So one is the preparation, and the second is results analysis and some conclusions. So if we see like that, then there is a wording, a special wording for that. It's used mostly in psychology, but we definitely should take it as psychologists. They do much more experiments with users. So the preparation phase is called realism, and this is any part that is leading to the experiment, from how we set up the lab itself or how we set up the software to measure, up to the way we ask questions. And this is realism. And then the validity is any aspect of the results we obtained and comparing those results to a specific aspect of the reality. Okay, so this is important. We will keep the color to make it a little bit easier. Now, if we go to the taxonomy, there is actually lots of different words related to experiment design, and both from realism and validity point of view. But with Margaret, we thought that actually there are, for our community point of view, let's say that there are 5 things that are especially important. So first, it will be the preparation, 2 terms related to preparation, and one is mundane realism, and this is everything that describes the preparation of the experiment itself in sense of the setup. And psychological realism is everything that is focusing on how the user will think or feel, and especially what kind of state, how far the state of the mind is from the real use case. Okay, so we would say that, and those terms are continuous. This is very important. Yeah, so mundane realism can be nearly, we would say that the mundane realism is nearly 0 the moment we make a setup, for example, where we fix a head of a tester and the distance to the screen, and the tester is testing a mobile screen but cannot touch it, cannot interact anything, and something is moving there. The head is totally fixed, the monitor is fixed, all the lights are fixed. Well, this is probably as far from real use case of mobile phones as you can imagine. On the other hand, we can imagine an experiment where users simply interact with a phone daily basis, anytime she wants, and just pick up a phone and do a task on the phone. Then, of course, the mental realism of such a scenario is much higher. There will be different lighting. There will be the tester decides on how far away should be the phone from the face and things like that. What is very important is that it's the goal of any research is not to have very high mental realism. It's not better research, it's different research, yeah? So we should understand that what we want to describe very clearly are differences. And the same with psychological realism, again, well, just asking about quality, we already changed the behavior of users. So this is obviously decreasing the psychological realism comparing to when I watch Netflix, I'm not focused on the quality of the content. But of course, quality plays a role there somewhere. Then about validity, so results, there is internal validity, which is defined by the degree. So it's basically, I know my experiment does not have errors. So this will be internal validity. And external validity, very important here, it's to how much I can use my results in the real world. So let's say I do this experiment where I fix user's head in front of the mobile phone, and then I play some, I don't know, 3 different cartoons compressed in a different way. I obtained some results from those people. Now the question is, will people really in real life see the difference between those different codecs that I tested in this way? So if yes, if really I can build a product and this product will be better because because of the results of my tests, it means that the external validity is very high. And definitely we are interested in the external validity as any community. So everyone is interested in using the experiment results outside of the experiment itself, but the very important part of the term external or internal validity or population validity is that we are able to test it. So it means that to test external validity, I really need the external data. So I need to have data from the real world and then comparing with my lab study and then show kind of, yes, you see, I use a better codec based on those studies and I obtained those and those results on the real world. And again, population validity is just related to the population that we are testing. Those definitions comes from publication and also the psychology, American Psychology Association dictionary. And all those terms, if you look online, you can find slightly different definitions, but they are more or less, to some extent, they are similar. Now, the next thing we did was checking, okay, how those terms are used. So we checked IEEE papers, number of IEEE publications in full text and metadata that used certain terms like external validity, internal validity, population validity, psychological realism, and mental realism. And as you can see here, basically those terms are not used at all. So especially mental realism, 16 papers in all IEEE, full text. It could be citation of the paper in which title has a word mental, has term mental realism in it. Yeah? So it's not, we don't know even if those terms are really used in those papers or are just mentioned nearly by accident. And the question is, what is this missing row? And this missing row is ecological validity. So it seems that the terms that we just defined are not really used, but ecological validity is used a lot. So why we would like to fight the term, especially that I used it just a year ago at the VQEG meeting. So here are the problems that we found with this term. So first problem, there's no clear definition of ecological validity. And this by itself, in our view, should be enough to really to really stop using it. So taking just the quick search on internet, we can find this American Psychological Association defines it in two different ways, actually, where the second definition is the original definition from around 60s. And this definition is very, very specific. So this is comparison between clues of a perceiver in relation to some object of event in the environment. Well, this definition is really not clear in my opinion. So just to explain you what are the examples will be if I walk in a forest and I hear certain sound, I will interpret this sound differently than if I hear exactly the same sound in the laboratory. Simply because in forest, I can kind of think about, I don't know, a bird that is chasing me, and I know that in laboratory it's impossible. So those are like those. This is the clue word in the definition. So this definition got nothing to do with how it's used in most of the publications and most of other definitions that we found. So, for example, this Funny Web's helpful professor, ecological validity is subset of external validity, especially focusing on whether behaviors observed in a recorded in a study can be extended to occur in real world settings. So this is by far the most common definition. Okay, so someone could say, well, so the definition is not really clear because there is a very old definition nearly not used, and the new definition is very clear. Ecological validity is a subset of external validity. Well, this is not totally true, because what we did next is checked how ecologically validity is really used in different publications. So we extract publications, this time the publications that are mentioning ecological validity in the title or abstract, so much less publications. And then Margaret was able to go through all those publications and checked what is actually the definition and what we can see here. So first definition that we found is simply false. Yeah? The extent to which an experiment reproduces the situation and environment in which the technology will be used. So let's say I use this mobile phone where people use it daily basis, they take out the phone and just do experiment, and hence the extent to which the research finding generalize. So it's saying that if I do my experiments on a mobile phone that people pick up from a pocket in any situation, so how they use any other application, so automatically the obtained results means that we can generalize them, and I know that if I create a product on this basis, I can just generalize the results and the product will be simply better. Well, the problem with this is we don't have any proof that this is true. We really have to compare to the real world data to know that this is true. Then there are definitions which are clearly external validity. It's kind of popular. The ecological validity is characterized as whether or not one can generalize from observed behavior in the laboratory to natural behavior in the world. But this is literally nearly word by word external validity definition, which makes no sense. Yeah, we've got already the term that is even used much more often. Yeah, so there's not really much sense. Sometimes the extent to which study comprise real world to use of the system, which is Mantel realism, and so on and so on. I won't go through all of this, but you can see that from just 118 papers, we're able to find all those different definitions. So at the end, we have this table where we extracted all those definitions, and really they are used differently. But with this table, I have one more kind of request to the community. So see that 118 papers mentioning ecological validity in the title or abstract never used the term in the paper itself. So in my opinion, this is really kind of problem that we could try to address with our review process. Because if someone is using the term, well, probably should really maybe define the term, but even if not defined, that this would be nice really to describe more details and not just use a buzzword. So all those 44 papers, I would say that this is more buzzword than a real use case. There are some papers where this is undefined, and again, this is really huge group. And this I can understand because probably some people just think that this is so obvious that they don't have to define it. Yeah? And then, as you can see, the papers which really define it, they really define it differently. So this one reason, in our opinion, should be enough. But there's the second problem with ecological validity, and this is false assumption. So in the ideal situation, what we should have is that we do an experiment, we collect some data from the real world, and then we testing the external validity of our experiment by comparing the data from the real world and the data from the experiment. And this is the ideal solution. Of course, with this solution, the problem is that if I have the real data, why I bother with experiment? Yeah? And in medicine, it's kind of obvious. But in our case, it's not so obvious, but still, this is the correct solution, and there's no other solution. The problem is that the real world data are very difficult to collect, and especially in our case, they are to some extent impossible, because what does it mean to know what is the quality, what people think about quality of the Netflix video? As long as we don't ask them, there's really small chance they will even express it or anyway even react to it. Maybe they don't like quality, but they still watch because they are so much interested in the content. So even the reaction of what they are doing, it's not really answering the question. So we quite often do not have the data. Now what people do, they prepare experiment, combine it with realistic environments. So let's say I put a sofa, I put relax lighting, maybe put a flower by the TV set. And now I'm saying I collected the data in the way that is so close to the living room where people really see a video on a daily basis, that I just assume that I have external validity. So if they in my lab said that this is bad quality, it means that they think the same at sitting at the sofa in their home. But I don't do any comparison with the real world data, because still I don't have those data. I simply assume it. And as we said, it's with Margaret, this assumption is simply magic. Yeah? There's no data, no reason to believe that this is true. Yeah? So this kind of assumption behind ecological validity as a, let's say, key to obtain the results that we cannot really obtain because we don't have real data results is very important. So just to be very precise, what we can do, we can check the internal validity of our new experiment design. So when we have improved experimental methods, like we did within VQEG, for example, one of the Margaret's experiment where different labs in different conditions do experiments. So we then can compare the traditional experiment, so conventional experiment, like a typical ACR in the lab, with this improved experiment methods where we, for example, do not restrict so much some setup, and then we can validate the internal validity between those two experiments and how much the new setup changes. The other thing we can, of course, do, we definitely can say that we change the model realism, so we hope that the data are closer to the reality. So it's not like we cannot do anything. What we really would like to see is that people clearly say, okay, I didn't have the external data, I cannot check external validity, but I hope that this improvement in the model realism is really improvement so our external validity. It's perfectly okay, yeah? Just be very clear. So then we can really understand better what is published. Okay, so the first conclusion, please do not use ecological validity, although I already used it in numerous of papers. And then, of course, besides you are really interested in this original definition, we found it in 4 papers out of those 118. So it's not like it's not completely used. But probably the use cases are very, very small comparing to what we see. Use other terms. This will very help us to follow what are the changes, for example, for experiment design. Let's say if your goal is really changing the subject mindset, so this is more describing psychological realism, comparing to, for example, focusing on other aspects of the experiment. If we describe it clearly, this would be really easier to think about this extending to new modalities in quality of experience. And then also, we really encourage to report about mental realism, psychological realism, and population validity in your papers. Even if the report is like, we didn't change anything from the standard, we assume that the mental realism is the same as described in the standard. Probably very low because we show short sequences, not related. We ask about qualities of psychological realism. It's also pretty low. It's okay, yeah? It's not like everything has to be changed, but the thing is that then the track of change will be much easier if people honestly describe it, yeah? And if you really think you are able to report external validity, because, for example, you have cooperation with a big player who has some data that no one else can have from the real system, then this report should really compare the real data with the data from the lab. Only then we can say something about external validity. Yeah? And this is very important because those papers would be very, very, very influential, but only if they are really following the correct, let's say, order. Okay, this is it from my side. If there are any questions, I would be more than happy to answer, or Margaret will answer them. I see questions. So, yes.
Yes, very interesting presentation. Thank you. And one of your slide, I think, can you go back to your slide with external validity, your bubble chart near the end?
Ah, okay. So this would be the correct external validity, let's say.
Yeah, the one that you had, the realistic environment, I think it's slide 18. So are you saying here that the recreating a realistic environment in a lab is not accurate, or it's not a good practice? Or I was just trying to understand the message here.
Okay, so sorry that I wasn't true. So the most important part here is that even if you create realistic setup, it doesn't mean you obtain directly results as they are in the real use case. So realistic environment doesn't mean real data, real world data. Okay. It just means that you are probably closer, but you are just guessing. Because actually what could happen is that, for example, to create this realistic setup, you could decrease, I don't know, population validity. Because let's say that setup is enough complicated that you are using only students. And then at the end, actually, the external validity that you are interested in can be lower because of the specific students, specific population validity, let's say, constraint, than for a typical experiment where you invite many people together. So the thing is that there's like...
So your message here is that we need to be cautious about if we do that, it might be okay, but we're not comparing the real world. So you need to disclose that or be aware of it. Is it the message that you're trying to
Yes.
convey here?
Yes. So let's say an example, a great example is the paper that we started, that we were writing with Margaret, is about an experiment that we run at HEH, where people came, selected movie at Netflix, and they watched the whole movie, and we just break it each 2.5 minutes asking about quality. We also change the quality of the movie, but they watch whatever they want. And claiming that because the results was obtained in this setup, they are we have high external validity, it's not true. Well, those results are different from traditional subjective experiments, but this doesn't mean that they've got very high external validity. Still, we've got poor psychological validity, for example, because we are focusing those people on quality. Still, we've got very low Mandel realism in terms of the network conditions, because we change quality so much that I doubt any user in the world ever has seen so many changes of the quality of any Netflix movie. So there are still lots of problems with any experiment you can imagine comparing to the real world. Claiming that because I changed those, I don't know, 5 out of 50 factors, now I've got the results that are so close to the reality, it's just making problems. Yeah, if we very clearly say, well, what we want to have for the community is saying Mandel realism of this experiment was improved in those factors and still is wrong in those factors. Psychological realism is better in this sense, worse in this sense, or the same to the other experiments. Yeah, population validity in this sense is better, in this sense is worse. This is all. And then we can combine many different experiments and see some results and see some conclusions.
Thank you for talking about these very subtle but important elements here. Thank you.
Thank you. Pablo?
Hi. So yeah, I've also used it in one of the papers that you have read. And in principle, I think that what we are trying to do under the broad umbrella of ecological validity, and if you search in IEEE papers, we are probably all of us in similar situation, is that we don't have access to users or to the service directly in most cases. So we try to figure out how to do something closer to what we try to address at the end. So, and since this is a bit of a guesswork up to some point, then there's probably a reason for this to be used in a very relaxed way. Probably because we don't have so the ability to go farther than that, or in another sense, or put it in a different way. How realistic it is that actually researchers are able to address validity of the experiments in the type of experiments that we do in a robust way with with the budget that the experiments have in practice. This is basically something that comes to my mind is that maybe we should, or maybe you could try to do something similar to what you did yesterday with the analysis of the P13 recommendations, which is try to build a scorecard for people to analyze their own experiments or other people's experiments in terms of validity, so that you can somehow, as you mentioned before, characterize your experiment and characterize the factors of experiment in a systematic way. That would be probably a bit more helpful in the sense that the presentation as it is today looks a bit disencouraging. It's like, okay, this is impossible, I won't care about it anymore. So somehow something a bit more actionable should be a way to progress, right? So something, because there's a reason why people is not using this taxonomy, and the main reason is it's because probably you cannot afford that. You will not have real world data in most cases. So if the answer to that is if you don't have real world data, you cannot do anything, then okay, people will not do anything, and this taxonomy will never succeed. So there should be an actionable way to progress into validity in a way which is actually doable by researchers.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so answering this question, and I kind of do not agree that we can use a term wrongly because we cannot use it correctly, especially that there are different terms. Yeah, so we should be focusing on bringing better Mandel realism that probably brings us closer, and this is exactly what we are doing. Yeah, most of those papers are actually increasing Mandel realism, but they call it external validity or ecological validity, or probably sometimes external validity, difficult to say, just because it's kind of more sexy word. Yeah, we really shouldn't do it. Yeah, like there is a term, let's use it correctly as it should be used. And we've got a different term. So our proposal is really, I wouldn't like to make it negative. I would like to make it systematic. So you change the setup of the experiment, describe the setup of the experiment. You tested the data in such a way, describe as testing the data. But, and of course there is a one kind of thing, like even if, let's say I'm somehow become a person that can access all the data that has meta instantly, and do any analysis I can imagine, still my real world data will be just approximation of reality, because I cannot get like the information about what people think about quality. Even Meta don't have it, yeah, with all the things. So even if we think about external validity, we will compare it to a specific data analysis of the real world data, but at least it will be real world data analysis. And by the time, what we can do. So first of all, we can definitely focus on increasing Mandel realism, psychological realism, and things like that, and really carefully checking if internal validity of our test is correct. This is one thing. And the second thing is just practice, yeah? So like the success of Netflix service that is able to fit a whole series in 2 episodes shows clearly that the ACR scale experiments got very good external validity. Yeah? We simply see it, yeah, by this example. Yeah, so based on those experiments, the codecs were improved, and the codecs improvements clearly works, yeah, in those services. So there are some subtle things that are changing, and we can kind of make conclusions. But in my opinion, what is very important is to be very clear about the source of the information. So like what I just said is kind of guessing. Maybe there's a different reason why it works so well.
And I would like to add, Pablo, I agree with you. To some extent, we have a limited ability to really get that real world data, but there are some things we can do that are a little more ad hoc, like questionnaires at the end of a test. And it's not strong proof that the external validity has improved, but it's at least some evidence. And as Lucian said, we're mostly just concerned with clearly communicating what's being done, not changing what people are doing.
Thank you.
Shireen?
Yes. Thank you for explanation. I also use this definition a lot. And then maybe I could ask one question. There is a paper that I referred to that, and I liked it. It was the title was Towards Enhancing Ecological Validity in User Studies. It was a systematic review. And then there is one description there. Ecological validity is a goal, but not a destination. And when I want to make some link between this statement and what I'm working, that it is relevant to teleoperation, that it is really difficult applying to the real world situation due to not a gender balance in expert when we want to have a participant, and if the participant should be expert and then they are not in the gender balance in the reality, or it is very difficult for doing some experiment in the mine or construction content. So what I want to say that here, and this statement, ecological validity is a goal but not a destination, it represents somehow for me the mundane realism in my use case, and then not maybe it could be also external validity, but I don't know if we try to enhance some aspects, maybe it could be in the category of psychological realism. So it is a bit loose for me.
Yeah, yes. So definitely what you are doing, like I remember your work, so you are doing is actually you are targeting both Mandel realism in the sense that your experiments are mimicking the real world, and psychological realism in the sense that people do nearly the same task. But of course, and this should be very clearly explained why we think, and then we could write that probably external validity is very high of those experiments. But like we cannot kind of imagine having a setup that is closer. But actually, to really check it, what you would need is to do something that is obviously completely impossible. So, like for example, this unloading trees or loading trees for a truck, and then just make a system that will randomly generate some delay with it, yeah, for the real workers. Yeah, I'm sure they would be delighted with such an experiment. Sometimes if the system is crashed, for example, we can get some real data. Let's say that something went wrong, and then they called you or called the company and said that there is a certain delay and we don't like it. Yeah? And then kind of maintenance of the system could give us information that we check the tracks, and let's say as long as the delay is not as long is shorter than whatever 500 milliseconds, they never really report this as a problem. Yeah. But if this is over, then they start to report the problem. Those are the real data then, and then we can compare it, and then we can see that in our experiment, also 500 milliseconds was this peak where people really will start to be annoyed with it. And this is, so it means that our experiments have got very high external validity. But really, I think that Mandel realism and psychological realism, if we have high Mandel realism, high psychological realism, it's already very, very correct approach, and this is already excellent.
Yeah, thank you so much for explanation.
Thank you. And Camille is next.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I have one small comment. So usually when you increase the realism, you lose validity in a way. So you have to find balance between both of those, yeah? So there's nothing wrong with doing experiments with low realism. Maybe I will highlight that. And what I missed is like maybe some temporal perspective on that, or pipeline. So it's good to start with really good validity and with low realism, and then try to add one by one the realism. So when you know your what you measure in a small scale, so you know your internal validity, then you can go one by one to add some factors for like increasing the realism. Yeah, so it's all depending on your goal, and it's completely fine to do studies with low realism, and then you can increase realism to see if those effects that you know are still holding. It's a bit the paper that you are finishing right now is basically about that. Yeah, so we have a metric which was basically trained in really low realism, and then we increase realism and it still holds. Yeah, so we know that in this particular setup, the realism wasn't the goal, yeah, as Shirin's mentioned before. There's nothing wrong with the simpler studies, and I think this temporal perspective is also important to do it from simpler studies with high validity and increase it later on instead of going directly to high realism. I think that's important.
Yeah, no, thank you for the comment, and this is exactly yes what we think. Yeah, so if you change experiment, of course, compared with conventional experiments, this is very good practice. But don't claim that because you change experiments, you already know everything about the reality. Okay, seeing no more questions, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Lucian. That was really interesting. So we have one more presentation today, and the norm presentation 206. Let's see what that was.
That's Yanis and myself on
Okay.
what been up to the past few months. Yanis, would you like to take the lead? Yanis? Okay, he's clearly stepped away from his computer, and I had assumed that Yanis would be showing the slides. So let me bring up the slides.
I'll check his I'll send him an internal message, Margaret.
Okay, thank you. Now he had a
Yes, I'm available.
Oh, good. Wonderful.
Sorry about that. Would you mind presenting, Margaret, simply because I cannot find the file?
Yes, I'm saving right now. I'll open it.
Σε παρακαλώ πάρα πολύ. Απλώς θα πρέπει να ανάψω εσύ. Άστα εκεί όπως είναι. Συγγνώμη που δεν σε βγάζω. Sorry about that. Let me know when you're ready, Margaret.
It's so practical when you speak in different language with your kids. It's clearly not for us.
Okay, there we are. Go ahead.
So again, my apologies all. This is a short presentation about some of the observations we made during the norm sessions, and I just call it Gen AI content, and this was drafted by myself and Margaret. So Margaret, next slide, please. So I think that not just for norm, but overall, I think the topic of Gen AI, and I use this term generically, and it can be interpreted by different people in this call, but to me is anything that is generated by a computer, and ideally with a prompt, right? Because computers can generate many things depending on what you ask them to do. But nowadays, the overloaded term Gen AI typically refers to the content that is generated by a big LLM engine, a large language model, when prompted by a user. So This topic came up through our discussions over quite a few norm meetings. And the consensus that at least I sensed during this discussion that there is interest by the norm group to address this topic. And again, from the, I can say classic different angles, but a few new ones, right? The first one is something that I think we have dealt with many times in the past, right? What type of subjective methodology is best suited for Gen AI content? Now, you understand that we can go through the classic ACR, DSIS, pairwise comparison, but again, the most important difference is that Gen AI content has a certain intent behind it. So by simply asking someone how good is what they're saying, we are risking the biggest problem, which is that this content was requested by a certain user through some kind of prompt. But I'll come back to this later, right? So the type of subjective methodology is one big item that I invite the group overall to consider, specifically for the Gen AI content. The second topic is what type of stimuli, one then, assuming that we found the subjective methodology, how can we ensure good coverage or characterization of a certain LLM engine to what stimuli should we choose to do subjective tests with, right? You understand that in this case, we talk about how to cover both the most probable stimuli that one can encounter. Give me a video of someone running, or give me a cat that is playing on the grass. But at the same time, one would also like to cover what are known as corner cases, right? Give me a bear that's in a spacecraft that goes from the Earth to the moon, right? So there could be very different behavior between the expected and most probable behavior of an LLM and the corner cases. Now, after you have solved, let's say, or partially solved the subjective problem, we always go to the objective one. So how can we design a no reference metric that can be used to essentially rate and evaluate this Gen AI engine, right? So once there is an engine, ChatGPT or our homegrown by Meta Llama engine, how would you then put it to the test and evaluate through, again, a set of stimuli, applying these no reference metrics that were designed, that this engine takes a score of 82 on a scale of 0 to 100 versus another engine that takes a score of 85. And now the most tricky part is that once you have such a no reference metric, then can that be used to perhaps produce a new Gen AI engine, say the next revision of ChatGPT or the next revision of Llama, by taking that into account when training in the loss function. And for those, and most of people nowadays have shifted anyways to ML and AI CNN-based models and training. You understand that this can be both a vicious or also a death spiral, right? If you really have a poor metric, that can lead easily to a model that actually is objectively worse, right? So these are the four aspects that at least were elevated during the most recent norm discussions. Next slide, please. Margaret, I think are we at the end?
Are you not seeing that second slide?
Oh, now I do. Sorry about that. Sorry, I'm now on the subjective methodology, right? So yes, to elaborate a little bit more on what I mentioned before. So again, the biggest difference, and I can say maybe in contrast to whatever happened in the classic image, audio, and video, where the stimuli were chosen out of thin air, as I say, right? So we literally said we have El Fuente, right? El Fuente is an existing.
Sorry, Yanis, I still see this slide status update, not.
Yeah.
Me too.
Margaret, I see subjective methodology. I'm not sure what others see. Maybe let's reshare and see what happens.
Okay, I stopped sharing and shared again. Can you see subjective methodology now?
It's
I see
still loading for
black.
me.
Yeah, I still see a blank screen. Okay,
Now,
now I see
yeah.
subjective methodology, right? Everybody's on the same page, literally.
Yeah.
Yes.
Good. Thank you. So again, let me walk you through at least what are my views. And by the way, I'm not reflecting my personal views. I try to collate here also the, I can say the group consensus or wisdom or diverging perhaps in some cases opinion, right? So without a doubt, there is a concept of an intent behind all that stimuli that are generated by an LLM, right? So there is this famous prompt. While typically the stimuli that have been used in the traditional audio, image, and video testing, at least the most popular ones, I should say, I'm not excluding certain subjective testings that try to address the concept of the intent, is that there must be an association, in other words, that presents a stimulus paired with a corresponding input, right? So one, of course, could always choose to skip the prompt and just present the output, in which case you can ask the more generic questions that apply, let's say, quote unquote, regardless of the prompt. Is this of good video quality, right? The way we understand it, pixel quality, right? Or is this a natural video? How good is the aesthetic quality, right? And that can actually be asked not only on GenAI videos, but on traditional videos as well. Now, again, the key differentiation here, in my opinion, is that association or consistency. And I'll use an example. If I say, please give me a video that is from the 1960s, right? Early days of TV, that depicts an ugly dog having a haircut, then this is really literally what I asked for, right? I did not ask for high video quality. But in that case, the biggest, I can say, most important concept of consistency, right? And overall, you can say quality. Did this satisfy what I asked for? Becomes even more pronounced, right? So I would say that's, in my opinion, the million-dollar question. Can we as a group come together and provide subjective methodologies that can be used for this new class of videos, again, under the general umbrella of Gen AI, or as I like to call it, a computer-generated media following a human prompt. And let's go to the next slide. Okay. And again, this comes back to the other aspect I covered partially, right? What are these for subjective quality data sets, right? What would then a good Gen AI image and video data set be, right? Of course, you always have the classic issue of coverage, right? How do you make sure you have the maximum possible diversity in terms of content? How can we cover, let's say, again, both the most probable things that people ask, but at the same time, the more diverse? Then how can we make sure at some point, let's close our eyes and think that LLMs become really, really good. The question is, how do you generate content that can be objectively judged as not good? If the LLM engines become so good, how can we have the famous, spanning of the range, right? So at least when it comes to a classic scheme like a compressor, we can tune the bit rate or the quality parameter to cover low quality, medium quality, high quality, right? And by the way, I have long argued that in the quality front, or let me say the video compression front, I'm a little bit skeptic for people who are still, for example, trying to evaluate quality of QSIF images or even 240p. Even though we know very well that there is no application, at least modern application today, that is ever forced to go down to such low resolutions anymore, right? So there is always a need to recalibrate ourselves to what is the state of the art and adjust and address the range, but we may have the same problem with Gen AI content, where the content, for example, what if it's impossible to get bad looking content from an LLM? How do you make sure that we have that spanning of quality? HRCs, right? Which LLM should we use to generate those stimuli for subjective testing? Would you choose state-of-the-art, the latest and greatest, or would you, again, knowingly include older models simply because you know that older models had certain deficiencies and cover that low range of qualities? Should you use open or closed source LLMs, right? And then copyrights. How do you make sure, again, that the generated content doesn't have any restrictions, such as copyrights, that will make any subjective testing publication, etc., of the results problematic, right? So we need to address the copyright issue as well. And Margaret, do I remember well? This is the last slide, or?
I don't, next steps, yes.
Yes. It hasn't refreshed for me, unfortunately.
Let me stop.
Okay. Now I see it. Everybody on the same page, next steps?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So what are the next steps on this front? Again, as seen at least by the norm group, because I think there is a broader discussion that we plan to have when we talk about the organizational aspect of VQEG. So we do have these monthly online meetings, and we, want to collect proposals, both for the subjective testing methodology and for the stimuli questions. After we have these proposals and consolidate them, we'd like to conduct subjective tests, right? And it will go as usual, right? The usual way, as I say, small data set first. Then, have multiple methods, like do a cross design, the various proposals of the subjective methodologies, small data set to be able to iterate quickly, do the analysis, and hopefully come up with a draft ITU recommendation. Now, of course, that's always our North Star for quite a lot of activities, but allow me to say, definitely speaking, wearing my meta hat, is that this has a certain urgency to it. I think you all have seen many, many articles on how many companies are going like full speed ahead in delivering these Gen AI models. And there is a dire necessity to be able to at least quantify. So to have at least a recommendation that says, if you want to be an evaluator of a certain model, please use this methodology, please use this type of stimuli, please, do the statistical analysis this way and draw these conclusions, right? That would be a major contribution, I think, to the society, because a very simple survey I have both internally and externally from different, conferences I attend and different articles. It's really a wild, wild west situation right now, where everybody is sort of doing their own, thinking that it is the best thing to do. And therefore, it's even hard to compare the results of a certain researcher against the results of another researcher. So by offering a recommendation, it will really catalyze, and I think it will be a force to have that, whole Gen AI movement, if you like to call, or trend, be much more scientific. These are my thoughts, and I think that we can open up for questions or comments to the group. And again, my deep apologies for not responding quickly to the request for me to join.
I want to add one last thought before we get to questions. I'd like to point out that we haven't totally dropped the previous topic of a no reference metric that works for compression and rescaling and camera artifacts. That is a lower priority, though, to this Gen AI, which is clearly where people are interested. And we're expecting that sort of metrics for that scope to feed into the third bullet where we're analyzing proposed methods as a starting point for how do we get that no reference metric for these Gen AI content.
Indeed, and I would like to maybe pound on that point a little bit, Margaret, to say that it goes without saying that regardless how this type of videos are generated, they still need to be encoded, transmitted, scaled, and received in the, let's say, classical pipeline that was, heavily covered by the 5G KPI discussion. So all these other, let's say, considerations, compression artifacts, scaling artifacts, not so much camera capture anymore, right? Instead of camera, we have a computer acting as a camera. That's the component that is swapped. I believe are still remaining very valid. And hopefully there will be some additional maybe technologies introduced that better address this type of content. But just like we expect to have maybe dedicated compression engines, I'm really envisioning to have also dedicated or customized, perhaps, subjective methodologies and objective metrics that go along with it. And with that said, I think there are enough hands waiting. Margaret, could you moderate?
Sure. Lucian, go ahead.
Thank you very much. It is very, very interesting topic and for sure fascinating. I think that one of the very important part that I'm not sure was it mentioned it or is it a are you thinking about it? But in my opinion, it's kind of important about the use case. So I would test the system completely differently if I'm a creator of a certain thing. So let's say I just for fun try to generate an image with people on the ski, and this is really annoying. So I'm not sure, would it be interesting part of the experiment or not? The creators, or we assume that the image is already there or video is already there, and then we want to analyze it.
Yeah. So let me try to, first of all, understand your question better. Everyone is a creator. And I would like to emphasize that if I have to personally, this is my personal view, by the way, right? If I have to say what is really different about this new so-called Gen AI trend versus the more traditional, I call it special effects, right? So the fact that Hollywood could create very photorealistic and plausible videos by using computers, sometimes enhancing camera footage, right? The true definition of visual effects, but sometimes truly creating out of thin air, right? Through a rendering engine and those newer generation of both computer games, and that's why I see a very great affinity to the CGI group personally. But make no mistake, this was a reserved functionality for the very few people who had access to these very expensive visual effects engines and very, costly pipelines. So from that point of view, Gen AI is democratizing what previously was only available to selected few people. Therefore, if your question is, should the video be different whether I'm a professional creator versus an amateur creator? That's how I could interpret your. So what's your question exactly?
Sorry. I will try to explain. So for me, like the moment we create something with generative AI, there are two things. So first thing is how I interact with the system, how I create a prompt until I get something that I like personally. So let's say I'm doing slides for my talk, and for that slide I have the idea that I would like to have, I don't know, a crowd watching a big screen. And I'm asking generative AI, but it's getting me really, answers that are not very pleasing for me even. And then I have a couple of interactions, and finally I'm fine with it. Yeah.
I'm stopping you right there because again, my interpretation and my view, but again, I'm only speaking here not as a person, but as a co-chair of Norm, is that at the point where you just iterated, you use the mental quality indicator of what came out of your prompt, a mental one, not really a numerical one, and some threshold that said, I accept, I reject, right? It would be ideal if instead of you evaluating, there would be this new no reference metric that took the prompt, took what came out of the engine, that one instance, each one of these instances, and said, this is a 4 out of 5, right? And that hopefully coincided with your evaluation. Now, whether your threshold, because you are very picky, is 4.5, you didn't like it and you iterated until you hit that mental 4.5, is totally your choice, right? But the scope of what we're discussing here is not what is the threshold and whether that threshold is higher for a layman versus a professional. That is another important, perhaps, research problem that could be addressed of how good is good enough. But I think at the first stage, I think capturing at least a reflection of how people evaluate what they're seeing and maybe individual access. Is this consistent with what I asked? Right? Is it beautiful? Is it pleasing? But the exact questions to be asked is really what we're talking about here, right? Should this be the questions, or should it be, is this acceptable or annoying? Right? Is it good enough or not good enough? But fundamentally, in my opinion, should be for every single prompt and the associated output, you would like to have both a group of people weighing in on its goodness and hopefully later through training or other approaches, a metric that says, yeah, this is a 4.2. Does this answer your question?
Yes, to some extent. 10. So I would say that probably you are much more interested in the moment that the images are generated and now we are scoring them. So
Or
even
image or
with this
video or
scenario, I see two cases. Yeah. So one case is where people score it and they've got like limited time, let's say 2-3 seconds, or they can take as much time as they want. And again, do they know it? They spotting generative AI. I'm speaking about the experience with working with students. We've got this subject where we play with generative AI, and we really could see very quickly how they learn. So at the beginning, it's like, wow, those are great, and then very quickly people start to say, oh no, I know where to look to really see. Like I generate those skiers, and I know that actually the connection between boot and ski will be the fault. But then the problem is that does it matter really? It depends on how long the image will be used. Yeah. So
I don't see how this aspect, the one you just touched upon, is different from classical, let's say, quality assessment. Is it relevant for how long you are watching a stimulus? Could be, right? Do you allow 1 views or 2 views or 5 views? Is it, is it important if someone has prior experience to the topic, quote unquote, expert versus layman viewing? I think the exact same analogies we have been doing in traditional, classical, if you like to call it for now, subjective testing applies to this GenAI content. I think the key differentiation between classical and GenAI to me is the presence of a prompt, right? You do provide someone to evaluate, this was the prompt, this was the output, now rate it for me. While on a classic
now I understand.
On a classic, again, the majority of classic does not provide any context, right? It says, here's a video, rate it for me. You don't know how this video was chosen. You don't know why this video was chosen. You don't know, was it, the details of it. So right now, I think this pairing is the way I interpret being the key differentiator. But I don't want to do the speaking. I want to do the listening. So Margaret, who is next?
Thank you.
Okay, next is Saman.
Yeah, thank you very much, Yanis and Margaret, for preparing this presentation. I just want to say some of my thoughts. Like, I mean, first of all, like I personally think that like Gen AI doesn't need to be just with prompts. So there are many examples of Gen AI, so which comes with basically just, let's say, the depths and another image, and then you can have a new form of the image, so to be created, or like two, let's say that the images.
Yes. Sorry if I stop you there. I want to be very concrete. Just randomly, you give an image and say nothing to the LLM, and something else comes out. Absolutely nothing.
No, I can show you. Actually, I will probably spoil a bit tomorrow's presentation that nobody does, but it's one example of IP adapter, for example. They take two images, you take the control, and then you have a new generated image out of that. And this is Gen AI. And even I think even super resolution to me is Gen AI. If you use any GAN models in super res is already Gen AI, and even.
But I'm stopping you there again. But still, there is a silent prompt here. Give me something better or give me something similar is the hidden prompt. Maybe it's not an explicit prompt that I talked, but isn't there a hidden assumption that there is some objective behind the LLM to create from A to B?
There's no LLM, for example, in this case involved in that. So you can have LLM. So you can add like wearing glass, for example, and then you have that. But you can also not have it, and that's up to you. But what I want to say is like, not necessarily the prompt is playing a role. It's widely used, I agree. So, but not necessarily. And that's something I believe like it's totally fine if we can scope it to have like prompt to image. But I want to say that like the field is really massive, like number of different cases that we can call it as generative AI. And many of us work mostly with the prompt to image, but I can see more and more other works that we have control over them. So is coming out. And the reason is that like many cases people want to add a new feature. For example, they want to add a new person in the image that already exists, and still it is a generative AI, because even though it's like merging two images, still like it adds lots of details like in background and many other things. And even the super res. Yes.
Allow me to stop you there, because again, I have reflected long and hard, and maybe my perception is wrong, and I would like to really learn. The way I understand it, all the examples you just mentioned, I'll pick the example. Here is an image. I want you to put Yanis's face in it, right? It's
Yes.
a case of a multimodal prompt where the image, the source, if you like to call it image, is part of the prompt. New LLMs don't accept only language, right? New LLMs, at least the way I have seen them evolve, say, here's an image, here is a music track, here is a setup, here is what I want to do. So there is truly multimodal. The concept of prompt should not be tied up to text. But the way understanding what you just described is here an image, here is Yanni. By the way, it may not be Yanni. Yanni may just be a name where you expect the engine to go and look up, find a face of suitable face for Yanni. So it could be a text or the actual Photoshop of Yanni. And here's the objective. The objective is to put Yanni in a natural place. So it's sort of a cook. I like to call it the input to whatever engine. Could be LLM, could be something else. But in principle, we have the classic input, system, output, right?
Yes.
So the way I see Gen AI is that we look on the input and the output as pairs when we're doing evaluation. We don't just look at the output to evaluate. In the absence of the input, you literally could have anything that is rated from a 1 to 5 for the exact same stimulus, right? So as the example I used before, if I ask, give me a 60s video, right, of this very ugly contraption, if I didn't know that input, I would have rated it very low given today's video quality standards, right? But again, I'm stopping here because I really truly want to understand, are there truly cases where machines without any input provide something? And you just said me there is, but the examples I heard all point to a multimodal prompt.
I mean, we can have even diffusion models we randomly from noise get to image without any actually control or anything to give it in. I mean, we can give any information to it, but an image or something like to get close to that, but not necessarily. I mean, it will not be properly used. But in general, I agree. Just want to say, like, what I want to say is, like, you can have cases of Gen AI so that you have like 5, 6 images and plus a prompt together, they will give you a result. So, which Lucian also mentioned, for example, you can have a multiple basically prompt right after each other. So which one is correcting another one? And I personally think like those prompts, you cannot say that like the last prompt is the one that we take it and then the output of that is out. Basically, there's a mixture of multiple prompts that Lucian, for example, engineered that and basically resulted in the image. And it might be also plus the images that are generated before, and that's how Lucian actually got to know where is going wrong. So that's why he's adding something new. So I don't want to make it very complicated, but I think something is very important is like we need to really say that what is our use case. So what we are calling here as Gen AI, like the definition is not very important, but it's like we said that we are going to work on the prompt to image generative models, and we are trying to solve this use case because each use case will have a different ways of dealing that. And then we want to say like we would like to have a full reference model, and full reference meaning is a bit different. Here, our reference is basically our prompt, and we would like to know how far we are from that prompt and the eyes of the people. So, and that's the way at least I see it. So, and then of course I will also say that like there will be one good use case, and there will be one subjective test we can design for that. And the idea is to know how well the model is generated, because there are people running also subjective tests to train another use case. So of, for example, a vision language model out of that. So, and they want to know how well the basic vision language model is evaluated here, but it gives you more information just in the score. It tells you like, there's the image looks very good, like in this dimension, but also has some problem in the semantic part of that. So you can, based on what we want to train or what we want to use, I think we might want to also design the subject just very differently. So because in one case you might want to just get a score, and in one case you want to have also more information what went wrong in that image, and that those things are important for such types of training of such vision language model. But if I understand well here, so what we want to do is prompt to image, and we would like to have some sort of full reference because we want to know how far we are from that prompt. So we don't want to be blindly basically looking at an image and say that we are doing good or bad. So because it will be also very different. And then I think another thing I would like to bring up is like we need to also define some dimensions, because the meaning of many new generated image will be very different for me and you, because so some part of that is coming from semantic issues. So, but everything is not one score for me, and the score of I think diversity of the score we get will be massive. So because my interpretation from that prompt will be very different than anyone else here. It has a language barrier, probably linguistic issues. There will be also like intention issues. It could be background of our knowledge. So I might know, for example, Obama very well because I have seen it in US a lot. Maybe someone in US, but someone, for example, never actually look into the image of Obama, like maybe once in their life. He might not realize the how well it should be constructed, and those things
just adding on to the examples you just gave someone. So from the perspective of dimensions, for example, if there is a taxi cab in the image and we want to enhance that particular image and see how like the Gen AI model can make it better. So let's say one of those generations that so one of the images that the model generated was of the taxi cab, but it is blue in color, versus another taxi cab which is the same color but in a different direction. Like the pose is different. It's maybe from the side or from the top. And so in that kind of a scenario, how would the subjective the person who's giving the subjective rating, how will they analyze such an image? Would be depending, like it might depend on the kind of dimension the person is viewing, um like like taking into consideration for giving a subjective rating in this kind of a scenario.
I'm only interrupting because we are, Margaret, you are the controller of time. I know we are 3 minutes, I think, past the session, and I'll gladly, expand further for as long as the group wants, but I want to be cognizant of people maybe having others. And perhaps I'm very happy that this stirs interest, which means that we have lots to learn and communicate. Again, I think we can, at the minimum, I think we can walk out of this with a solid, at least, plan of action, right? Now, whether it's going to be very open-ended and cover the universe of scenario that we are discussing here, or more restrictive, perhaps as a first step to achieve something concrete, I think it's up to this group, and I would like really. So why don't you tell us, give us a time frame? Should we move this, perhaps to, if we have room for a different session, or keep going?
Well, we are at the end of our time, and we, let's see, our next meeting for this norm discussion is December 9. So I would encourage everyone who's not already on the norm reflector, subscribe yourself. I will send you meeting invitation. You can also reach that meeting invitation from the VQEG homepage. And let's continue discussions on the 9th.
There are also time tomorrow. I mean, if people would like to discuss after the CGI session, which has not been scheduled yet.
I was about to suggest the same, assuming that someone in Nabajit are in line. I personally see that the discussion to maybe revamp or rename or however you think, or integrate CGI is, in my opinion, very relevant to this Gen AI discussion, because from the very high level point of view, both computer generated, CGI are computer generated images, period, right? No matter whether there was or there wasn't a prompt. So from that conceptual point of view, it makes sense to either unify or look at them as a holistic approach. So if you like, we can pound that ball for the discussion of CGI or go to the December norm call.
Yeah, sure. I mean,
I
the
think-
CGI will be very short discussion. So, and I think there was some miscommunication either from our side or like the other side. I'm not sure. Like, we never wanted to make a CGI, at least not from our side, like to make CGI as a generative AI group. So we wanted to move it towards more like point cloud and some new areas is going like rendering side. But I mean, we can discuss it for sure tomorrow. I mean, we have time for that. So. And the CGI discussion will be very short and just we will call basically that if anyone is interested to take the lead of that activity. So, and we will step down slowly from that, but that will be what we have in
I think,
CGI.
Margaret, why don't we do that? Why don't we talk about, say, where the Gen AI discussion falls more naturally under, remain under norm, move to a newly revamped Gen AI, and how that relates to the future of CGI? I think it's proper to be discussed in the CGI session. What do you think?
That sounds good. I will note on the schedule for tomorrow that we will continue the norm discussion on 206 after CAGI closes.
Sure.
Okay. And with that, thank you all. Very good feedback so far, and let's keep the discussion rolling.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
So I'm going to stop recording and hand over to Shell.
I don't have so much more to